My name is Leonora. If you've ever paid $300 for a tasting menu that promised to tell you a story, if you've ever watched a celebrity chef on television talk about the soul of an ingredient, there's a good chance you've tasted my work. For 5 years, I was the ghost in the machine, the silent architect behind the gilded facade of Jameson Kent. I was the one who translated his vague, aspirational ramblings into dishes that made food critics weep. I was the one in the searing heat of the kitchen at 2 in the morning, perfecting the precise temperature curve for a scallop until it was translucent, a jewel of the sea. I was the one who built the scaffolding of technique and taste that earned him his Michelin star. He just took the bows. He was the face. He was the name on the door. I was the flavor on the plate. This is the story of how I took my name back. And if you've ever been made to feel invisible, if you've ever had your work stolen and presented as someone else's triumph, then I need you to listen. It helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void. This isn't just my story. In a way, it's yours too. Last month, Jameson fired me. The words he used were slick with corporate polish, words like restructuring and streamlining. But the real reason was simpler and uglier. He said he needed to cut costs. My salary was the highest on the payroll, a fact he delivered with a look of pained apology that was more insulting than a sneer. He believed the magic wasn't in the magician, but in the spellbook. He thought he could keep the Michelin star gleaming just by using my meticulously documented recipe book, the leather-bound Bible I had poured my soul into for half a decade. He saw it as a simple instruction manual, a set of IKEA directions for genius. He assumed that my contribution could be distilled, copied, and pasted. He assumed I was replaceable. He was, in the simplest terms, wrong. So I did what any artist does when their work is stolen. I decided to perform it myself. I took the head chef position at the Gilded Spoon, a forgotten, struggling little place across town with peeling paint and a beautiful copper-top bar. It was a restaurant with a history but no future, the kind of place people walk past without seeing. For my opening night, I did something audacious. Some might call it petty. I call it a clarification. I invited Arthur Vance, the city's most feared and respected food critic, a man whose reviews could build empires or bury them. And for him, for the entire dining room, I cooked the exact tasting menu that had made Jameson Kent a star. Not a variation, not an homage, the original, my original. The seared foie gras with fig and balsamic reduction, the deconstructed bouillabaisse, the saffron risotto with bone marrow, every single dish, every secret, every note in the symphony he claimed to have composed. Right now, as I stand in my new kitchen, the smell of citrus and clarified butter hanging in the air like a promise, Jameson is probably sitting in his multi-million-dollar restaurant, sipping an overpriced espresso. He's about to open this morning's paper. He's about to read a review from Arthur Vance. But that review isn't just going to praise my new, humble restaurant. It's going to be an obituary. It's going to expose the great lie he's been living. It's a quiet, elegantly worded execution. He thinks he fired his head chef. He's about to realize he fired his soul. The meeting had been surgically brief. It took place not in his office, but in a small, sterile alcove by the service entrance, a space that smelled faintly of bleach and discarded parsley stem. It was a space for functionaries, for deliveries, not for the woman who had single-handedly designed the menu that brought him a global reputation. He stood there in his perfectly tailored chef's whites, a stark white against the gray concrete, looking not at me, but at a point just over my shoulder. It was a classic Jameson move, a way of speaking to you without acknowledging your presence as an equal. He said, "Leonora, we've had a wonderful run." A run, he called it, like it was a Broadway show, and I was a temporary cast member. He said the investors were putting pressure on him, that the margins were too thin. He used the word synergies 3 times, a word I knew he didn't understand. It was a verbal smokescreen, a cloud of jargon to obscure the simple, brutal truth. He was cutting me loose. The finality was in his eyes, a cool, detached dismissal that told me the decision had been made weeks ago. There was no negotiation, no discussion. It was an amputation. The most galling part was his assumption about the recipe book. He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. He said, "Of course your legacy will live on. We have the book, We have the foundation you built. He said it with a magnanimous smile, as if he were bestowing a great honor upon me. The book. He thought that collection of paper and ink was the source of the magic. He had no concept of the intuition, the timing, the years of trial and error that existed between the lines of those recipes. He couldn't comprehend that a recipe is just a map. It isn't the territory. I was the territory. My hands, my palate, my understanding of how heat and salt and fat and acid conduct their silent orchestra, that was the magic. The book was just the sheet music. He had fired the composer and thought the orchestra could play on its own. I just nodded. I let him believe it. I let him think he was winning. It wasn't about revenge, not then. It was about survival. But as I walked out of that service entrance and into the harsh afternoon light, a different feeling began to seed itself in my heart. A cold, quiet resolve. He hadn't just fired me. He had declared war on my art, and that was a war he was not prepared to fight. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and gray pavement. I kept the car radio off, the silence amplifying the roaring in my head. I parked in my designated spot, walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my small, quiet apartment, and closed the door behind me. For a moment, I just stood there in the entryway, my keys still clutched in my hand, the metal biting into my palm. The professional composure I had maintained in that sterile alcove, the mask of calm acceptance, was a fragile thing. It felt like a pane of glass with a crack spiderwebbing through it, and with the click of my front door, it shattered. I didn't cry. It was something deeper and more hollow than that. I slid down the wall, my back scraping against the plaster, until I was sitting on the floor. I just sat there, in the silence of my own home, and let the full weight of the last 5 years crash down on me. It wasn't just the firing. It was the slow, methodical erosion of my identity. It was the 1,000 tiny cuts that had finally bled me dry. My mind started to play the movie of my time at Kent's. It always does this in moments of crisis, replaying the past as if searching for the exact moment the wrong turn was taken. I saw myself on my first day, walking into the half-finished shell of the restaurant. Jameson had been a whirlwind of charm and vision back then. He had bought me coffee, his hands waving excitedly as he described his dream. He said he wanted to create a narrative with food, a place that was more than just a restaurant. It was a destination. He had the money from his family, the face for television, and the connections. What he didn't have was a palate. He couldn't cook, not really. He knew the theory. He had read the books. But in the kitchen, his hands were clumsy. His timing was off. He was a great talker, a brilliant salesman of his own myth. He told me, "I need a partner, Leonora, a culinary director, someone to be my hands, my palate. We'll build this empire together." The word together was the bait, and I took it. I was young, ambitious, and I believed him. I thought I was signing on as an architect, not realizing I was being hired as a ghostwriter. The memories flooded in, sharp and painful. The first rave review, in a major city magazine. The critic had praised the daring creativity of Jameson Kent, his genius pairing of flavors. My pairings, my creativity. I had stayed up for 72 hours straight, tweaking that menu, sleeping on a cot in the dry storage room. When the review came out, Jameson had slapped me on the back in the kitchen, out of sight of the diners, and said, "We did it, Leo. See? It's all about the brand." My name wasn't mentioned, not once, not even as head chef. I was just part of the anonymous we, the royal we that really meant he. I had swallowed the bitterness, telling myself it was a means to an end. The success of the restaurant would be my success, eventually. I was playing the long game. Or so I told myself. It's a lie we tell ourselves when our loyalty is being exploited. We call it patience, we call it strategy, but sometimes it's just fear. Then came the memory that truly twisted the knife. The night we got the Michelin star. The call came during the dinner rush. The front of house manager ran into the kitchen, his face flushed with excitement, and screamed the news. The kitchen erupted. There were cheers, hugs, tears. We had done the impossible. We had reached the pinnacle of the culinary world. I felt a surge of pride so intense, it almost brought me to my knees. This was it. This was the validation for all the sleepless nights, the burns on my forearms, the family events I had missed. Jameson came into the kitchen, his face a mask of practiced humility. He gathered everyone around. He gave a speech about teamwork and passion. Then he looked directly at me. He said, "Leonora, go home, get changed. I want you at the press table with me." A wave of relief washed over me. Finally, he was finally going to share the stage. I rushed home, my heart pounding. I put on my one good black dress, did my makeup for the first time in months, and raced back to the restaurant. When I got there, the scene was a frenzy of flashing cameras and reporters. I saw Jameson holding court, a glass of champagne in his hand. I tried to make my way through the crowd to the table he had pointed to earlier. A severe-looking woman with a clipboard stopped me. She asked who I was. I said, "I'm Leonora, the head chef." Jameson asked me to join him. She scanned her list, her finger tapping impatiently. She looked up, her expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. She said, "I'm sorry, there's no Leonora on the list. The table is for Mr. Kent and his investors." I stood there, frozen, in my black dress, feeling overdressed and utterly foolish. I looked over at Jameson. He caught my eye for a split second. He saw me, and he turned away, laughing at something a reporter had said. He just turned away. I didn't make a scene. I just backed out of the room, went in through the service entrance, changed back into my chef's whites, and spent the next 6 hours breaking down the kitchen. It wasn't about revenge. I told myself that over and over. It was about professionalism. It was about the team. But standing there, amidst the clatter of pots and pans, a cold, hard truth settled in my bones. He had never seen me as a partner. I was just a high-performing, incredibly reliable tool, and he would never ever share the credit. Sitting on my apartment floor, the memory was so vivid it felt like it was happening all over again. And the humiliation, the erasure, and I had stayed for 2 more years after that. Why? That was the question that haunted me. Why did I let him do that to me? The answer was complicated. The issue was complicated. It was a cocktail of misplaced loyalty, a belief in the work itself, and a deep-seated fear of starting over. I had built that kitchen. I had trained that staff. My soul was in the mortar of that place. Leaving felt like abandoning a part of myself. It was in that moment of despair that I first met Marco, properly. He was a young line cook back then, fresh out of culinary school, with wide, earnest eyes and hands that moved with a natural grace. He had seen me come back into the kitchen that night. He didn't say anything, but he was the only one who didn't try to celebrate with me. He just worked, quietly, efficiently, his eyes occasionally flicking towards me with a look of profound, unspoken understanding. The next day he came to me before service. He just said, "Chef, what you did with the halibut last night, the way you controlled the pan temperature, I've never seen anyone do that. It was art." He hadn't praised the dish. He had praised the technique, the craft. He saw me. He saw the work. From that day on, I took him under my wing. He became my protégé, my sous chef, the one person in that entire building who knew who the real artist was. His loyalty wasn't to the brand or the name on the door. It was to the food, and by extension, to me. The doorbell rang, a shrill, jarring sound that pulled me from my spiral of memories. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't want to see anyone, but it rang again, persistent. I heaved myself up and opened the door. It was a courier, holding a single, sad-looking cardboard box, my personal effects from the restaurant. Jameson hadn't even had the decency to let me pack my own things. The courier handed me the box and a clipboard, and I signed for it with a numb hand. I brought the box inside and set it on my coffee table. It was filled with the detritus of my life there. A stained apron, a few well-worn kitchen tools, a picture of my team from a staff party, and on top of it all, my recipe book, the leather-bound ledger, Jameson's legacy. I ran my fingers over the worn cover. He thought this was the key, the fool, but tucked inside the front cover was something else, a small paperback cookbook, its spine broken, its pages yellowed and stained with fingerprints and ancient spills. It was my grandmother's cookbook. I hadn't seen it in years. I had kept it tucked away in the back of my locker for good luck. I opened it. On the inside cover, in a familiar, slightly clumsy script, were a few words. "This is the real magic. Don't forget, Mer Marco." He had packed my box. He had known. He had seen the real me, not the ghost. And he had slipped this small, potent reminder in there. My grandmother was the one who taught me to cook. She didn't use recipes. She cooked with her senses, with memory, with love. Her food wasn't about Michelin stars or critics. It was about nourishment, in every sense of the word. Holding that little book, I felt a shift inside me. The despair, the hollow ache, began to recede, and in its place, a different kind of heat began to rise. Not the hot, messy fire of anger, but the clean, white-hot flame of a forge. It was the heat of creation, the heat of resolve. Jameson had taken my job, but Marco had reminded me of my identity. He thought the magic was in his restaurant. He was wrong. The magic was in me, and I was about to build a new temple for it. It wasn't about revenge. It was about resurrection. My own. The plan wasn't born in a flash of vengeful inspiration. It grew organically, out of the ashes of that awful day. It was a structure built from the foundations Jameson had tried to demolish. He thought my recipe book was his secret weapon, but my real power lay in the things that couldn't be written down, the assets he was too arrogant and too blind to even recognize. My foresight, my allies, and my hidden leverage. First, there was the book itself. He saw a collection of recipes. I saw a 5-year diary of my intellectual property. Over the years, I hadn't just written down ingredients and methods. I had documented my entire philosophy. Each page was a tapestry of technique. In the margins, I had sketched plating designs that were less about decoration and more about guiding the diner's fork, creating a specific sequence of flavors. I had included notes on culinary storytelling, a concept I had developed about how a tasting menu should have a narrative arc, with rising action, a climax, and a resolution. There were detailed temperature charts, showing the precise heat fluctuations needed to achieve a perfect sear without overcooking the delicate protein within. There were notes on the Maillard reaction, not as a chemical process, but as a source of flavor, a kind of controlled, delicious browning that I treated with the reverence of a painter mixing colors. More importantly, the book contained a section he would have dismissed as irrelevant: sourcing. It wasn't just a list of suppliers. It was a network, a web of relationships I had cultivated with small independent farmers, foragers, and fishermen. These weren't vendors you could find in a catalog. They were artisans, people who worked the land and sea with a respect that bordered on spiritual. They were people who didn't sell their produce. They bestowed it upon chefs they trusted. And at the heart of that network was my hidden leverage, my ace in the hole, a man named Alistair Finch. Alistair was a farmer, but calling him a farmer is like calling a Stradivarius a fiddle. He was a botanist, a historian, a recluse. He lived on a small, mist-shrouded plot of land 2 hours north of the city, and he grew things that didn't exist anywhere else. He specialized in heirloom vegetables, resurrecting strains of tomatoes, carrots, and herbs that had been lost to industrial agriculture for centuries. His star product, the one that underpinned 3 of the most famous dishes on Jameson's menu, was a tiny, jet-black tomato he called the Midnight Sun. It had a flavor profile that was astonishing, a perfect balance of sweetness, acidity, and a deep, savory umami that tasted like the earth itself. Getting to Alistair was impossible. He had no website, no phone number listed. You had to be introduced. I had spent 6 months earning his trust, not by talking about money or volume, but by discussing soil pH and the history of 17th century French gardening. Our arrangement was a handshake deal, a pact between 2 artisans, and the deal was with me, Leonora, not with Kent's restaurant. Jameson probably thought those tomatoes just showed up in a box from a generic produce company. He had no idea they were the product of a deeply personal and exclusive relationship. This was the kind of detail a man like Jameson, who lived in the world of branding and optics, would never think to check. It was a plausible, almost legalistic blind spot. He owned the restaurant, so he assumed he owned its supply chain, a detail that would prove to be his undoing. Second, there were my allies. The most important, of course, was Marco. A few days after I was fired, I called him. I didn't ask him to quit. I didn't want to put him in that position. I just asked him how things were. His voice was tight, strained. He said, "Chef, it's a disaster." Jameson tried to run the tasting menu himself. He has the book, but he doesn't have the touch. The timing is off. The balance is wrong. He's yelling at everyone. He thinks if he shouts the recipe louder, the food will taste better. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Jameson had tried to order the Midnight Sun tomatoes. He had called the main produce distributor, demanding to know where his special tomatoes were. The distributor had no idea what he was talking about. Jameson had thrown a fit, accusing them of incompetence. He had no clue that the linchpin of his signature dish came from a source that was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. My conversation with Marco was the confirmation I needed. My plan was no longer just a fantasy. It was a viable strategy. I told Marco to stay put, to keep his head down. I told him his time would come. His presence inside that collapsing kitchen was invaluable. He was my insider, my mole, a quiet observer of the chaos I was about to unleash. Then, I activated my other key ally, Alistair Finch. I drove up to his farm. The air there was different, clean and sharp, smelling of damp earth and pine. I found him in his greenhouse, tending to his seedlings with the delicate touch of a watchmaker. He was a tall, wiry man with soil under his fingernails and kind, intelligent eyes. He saw me and smiled, a rare and genuine expression. He said, "Leonora, I was wondering when you'd visit." He already knew. News in his world traveled through whispers and trusted channels, not press releases. I told him everything. He listened patiently, wiping his hands on a rough cloth. When I finished, he just nodded. He said, "That man, Kent, he's a peacock. All feathers, no substance. I never trusted him. The tomatoes, Leonora, they follow you. They are loyal to the hand that understands them, not the sign on the building." It was a simple declaration, but it was everything. My most critical supply line was secure. It was tied to me, not to a W-2 form. Some might say a handshake deal like that is foolish in the modern world, not legally binding, but they would be wrong. In the world of true artisans, honor and trust are more binding than any contract drafted by a team of lawyers. Finally, I needed a stage. I didn't have the capital to build a new restaurant from scratch. I needed a vessel, a place with soul that had been forgotten. I found it in the Gilded Spoon. It was a beautiful old space, but it was failing. The owner, a woman in her late 70s, named Eleanor Gable, was weeks away from bankruptcy. She had inherited the restaurant from her late husband, and she had tried to keep it running, but the world had moved on. I walked in one afternoon. The place was empty, save for Mrs. Gable, who was polishing the same water glass over and over at the bar. She looked tired, defeated. I introduced myself. I didn't mention Jameson Kent or the Michelin star. I just said, "I am a chef. I believe I can save this place." I told her my vision, a small, focused menu, locally sourced, built on technique and flavor, not trends. I told her I had no money to invest, but I had my hands, my knowledge, and a network of suppliers who would follow me anywhere. I would work for a percentage of the profits. If I failed, she would be no worse off than she already was. She looked at me for a long time, her gaze searching, assessing, and she was from a generation that understood character. She wasn't interested in my resume. She was interested in my spine. She saw the fire in my eyes, the quiet confidence in my posture. She said, "My husband, Robert, he always used to say that a restaurant is a living thing. It has a heart, and the heart is the kitchen. For the last few years, this place has had no heart." She slid a key across the polished copper bar. She said, "Show me you can make it beat again." That was it. No lawyers, no contracts, just a key and a challenge. a woman who had been erased, and a woman who was about to be. We were two ghosts, deciding to haunt the same house. This was my new war room, an old, forgotten restaurant, a reclusive farmer, a loyal sous chef, and a book of secrets that only I could read. Jameson thought he held all the cards. He was about to find out I had designed the deck. The first week at the Gilded Spoon was a lesson in humility and ingenuity. The kitchen was a museum of outdated equipment. The walk-in refrigerator hummed with a death rattle. The 6-burner stove had only 4 working burners, and the ancient convection oven had a hot spot the size of a dinner plate. At Kent's I had a state-of-the-art, custom-built kitchen, a temple of stainless steel and digital precision. Here, I had to rely on instinct and skill. It was purifying. It stripped away all the noise and forced me to focus on the essence of cooking. It reminded me that a great chef doesn't need a $100,000 combi oven. She needs to understand heat. Mrs. Gable gave me complete autonomy. She would sit at the bar for hours, watching me work, a small, hopeful smile on her face. We didn't have a staff, so I did everything. I scrubbed the floors, I polished the copper, I called Alistair and my other loyal suppliers, and arranged for deliveries to this new, unlikely location. The first time Alistair's unmarked van pulled up to the back of the Gilded Spoon, delivering a crate of his perfect, gleaming midnight sun tomatoes, I felt a thrill of clandestine victory. This was the first move in a silent coup. My first official act as head chef was to compose an invitation. I took a piece of simple, elegant, cream-colored cardstock from Mrs. Gable's old desk. I used her fountain pen, the ink a deep, dark blue. It was addressed to one person, Arthur Vance. The note was brief, just 3 sentences. Mr. Vance, there is a story you have written before. I invite you to come and hear the ending. I signed it simply, Leonora, with the address of the Gilded Spoon below. I didn't mention my last name or my previous employer. The mystery was the bait. I sent it via courier, knowing that his curiosity, his journalistic ego, would be impossible for him to ignore. A day later, his assistant called. Mr. Vance would be attending my opening night. The reservation was for 1, at 8 o'clock. The game was on. The next few weeks were a blur of focused, relentless work. I stripped the menu down to a single offering, the tasting menu. The very one Jameson thought he owned. It was a declaration. It wasn't about revenge. It was about authorship. I was signing my name to my own work, finally and irrevocably. Opening night arrived on a wave of nervous energy. The small dining room was full, a mix of curious locals and a few industry insiders. I had quietly invited. Mrs. Gable was at the host stand, her eyes sparkling with a life I hadn't seen in them before. In the kitchen it was just me. I was ready to cook for 30 people single-handedly, if I had to. The weight of it was immense, but it was a good weight. The weight of ownership. At 7:30, just as the first tickets started to come in, the back door of the kitchen creaked open. Marco stood there, in his chef's whites, holding his knife roll. Behind him were 2 of the best line cooks from Kent's, Miguel and Sophia. Marco looked at me, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. He said, "Chef, we quit." He told me the kitchen at Kent's had completely imploded. Jameson had brought in a crew of inexperienced cooks who were cheaper, but they couldn't execute. The final straw was when Jameson had tried to pass off regular store-bought cherry tomatoes as midnight suns, thinking no one would notice. Marco said, "I cannot cook a lie. Miguel and Sophia feel the same. We are with you if you'll have us." I felt a surge of emotion so powerful, I had to grip the edge of the stainless steel counter. This wasn't just about loyalty. This was a mutiny, an exodus based on principle. I looked at their faces, young, talented, and full of integrity. I said, "Welcome to the heart. Now let's make it beat." The kitchen came alive. We moved as a single organism, a dance of choreographed chaos. I had taught them over years of service. The muscle memory was there. We were a team, reunited in this small, forgotten kitchen. The energy was electric. We were cooking with purpose, with a shared secret. Marco was my eyes and ears. Between plating dishes, he would check his phone. He was getting frantic texts from a friend who was still working the service at Kent's. The news was grimly satisfying. Arthur Vance's table at Kent's, the one Jameson always kept reserved for him, just in case, was conspicuously empty. Jameson was in a state of escalating panic. He had been parading through the dining room, telling his wealthy patrons that Vance was expected any moment. But as the clock ticked past 8, and then 8:30, the narrative began to crumble. The staff knew Vance wasn't coming. The vibe in the dining room, Marco's friend texted, was turning sour. The great Jameson Kent had been stood up. Meanwhile, at the Gilded Spoon, Arthur Vance arrived precisely at 8 o'clock. Mrs. Gable seated him at a quiet corner table. From the pass, I could see the back of his head. He was a formidable presence even when seated. He didn't look around. He just sat, waiting, a predator in his natural habitat. The first dish went out, the seared foie gras with fig and balsamic reduction. It was perfect. The sear was a deep mahogany brown, the inside meltingly tender. I watched through the small window as Vance took his first bite. He closed his eyes for just a moment. A flicker of something, recognition, surprise, crossed his features. He didn't take notes. He never did on the first pass. He just ate, slowly, deliberately. One by one the dishes went out, each a ghost from another restaurant, now resurrected and given its true voice in this humble room. The deconstructed bouillabaisse, with its crystal-clear saffron broth. The risotto with bone marrow, so rich and decadent it was almost primal. And finally the dish that depended entirely on Alistair Finch, a simple, unadorned plate of sliced midnight sun tomatoes, with a drizzle of olive oil and a single flake of sea salt. It was the boldest, most arrogant dish on the menu, because it relied on nothing but the perfection of its core ingredient, an ingredient no one else in the city could get. As Vance tasted the tomatoes, he stopped. He looked down at the plate, then looked up, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on the small window to the kitchen. For a brief second, our eyes met. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply held my gaze. In that moment, I knew. He understood. He had the story. He knew he was holding the ending in his hands. The silent takeover was complete. The panic wasn't mine anymore. It had crossed town, and it was now festering in the heart of Jameson Kent's glittering, hollow empire. The morning after opening night felt like the day after a storm. The air was still, charged with a quiet, humming energy. I was in the kitchen by 6, alone, cleaning, prepping, my mind replaying every moment of the service. I was exhausted but wired, running on a potent cocktail of adrenaline and hope. I had sent Marco and the team home with my heartfelt thanks, telling them to rest. The real battle was yet to come. Mrs. Gable came in around 7, carrying 2 coffees and a copy of the morning paper, folded neatly under her arm. She placed it on the stainless steel prep table, right next to the cutting board where I was segmenting oranges. She didn't say a word. She just looked at me, her eyes bright, and gently tapped the folded newspaper. My hands were trembling slightly as I picked it up. I wiped them on my apron and unfolded it to the arts and culture section. There it was, a full-page review, a rarity reserved for only the most significant cultural events. The headline was simple, yet devastatingly effective. A ghost is born at the Gilded Spoon. My eyes scanned the first few paragraphs. Arthur Vance's prose was, as always, a work of art in itself. He didn't just describe the food, he vivisected it, celebrated it, elevated it to a plane of near-mythic importance. He called the foie gras a masterclass in classical technique, the risotto a velvet punch to the soul. He wrote about the dining room, the quiet dignity of the space, the palpable sense of a place being reborn. It was a rave review, the kind of critique that could turn a forgotten restaurant into the most sought-after reservation in the city overnight. But it was the last 3 paragraphs that detonated the bomb. He wrote, "The meal was, in a word, flawless. It was also, in another word, familiar. The culinary signature, the specific narrative arc of the tasting menu, was identical to the one that earned Jameson Kent his Michelin star 2 years ago. Not similar. Identical. Dish for dish, beat for beat. It was the same symphony, but the music was different. Here, at this humble little spot, the notes rang with an authenticity, a clarity that has been missing from Kent's increasingly hollow performances. My heart was pounding in my chest. He was doing it. He was connecting the dots for the entire world to see. The final paragraph was the kill shot. One is left to wonder, he concluded, about the nature of authorship in the culinary world. We praise the conductor, but what of the composer? Last night, at the Gilded Spoon, a ghost stepped out of the machine and into the light, and we are all the more enlightened for it. As for Kent's, one can only assume they are now in the market for a new soul. It appears their old one has found a new home. I had to sit down. I sank onto a low stool. The newspaper spread out before me like a declaration of independence. He had done it. He hadn't named me, not directly. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, he had given the world a riddle, a delicious piece of industry gossip that was far more powerful. He had given everyone the story and let them draw their own conclusions. It was masterful. The phone started ringing at 8:30. It didn't stop. Mrs. Gable answered, her voice a mixture of shock and glee. It was a flood. Reservation requests for the next 6 months. Food bloggers, journalists, even a television producer. My quiet little resurrection was about to become the biggest story in the food world. Around noon, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a number I knew all too well, Jameson. Errors, I let it go to voicemail. EC called again, immediately, and again. On the 4th try, I answered. I said nothing. His voice was a frayed rope, all the smooth, confident charm stripped away. Hugh, Lenora, what have you done? I remained silent. He was supposed to come here, he stammered, his voice cracking. Vance, he had a reservation. He always has a reservation. The review, he's destroying me. I finally spoke, my voice calm and even. I cooked him dinner, Jameson. That's all. You can't do this, he said, his voice rising in panic. You stole my menu, my concepts. This is theft. My lawyers will be in touch. Non-compete clauses, intellectual property. His threats were a hollow echo, the desperate flailing of a man who knew he had already lost. The non-compete was likely unenforceable, a classic scare tactic, and the intellectual property, the recipes were useless without me. We both knew it. Your menu? I asked, a quiet chill in my voice. That's interesting. I seem to have a copy of it right here, in my own handwriting. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of sputtering, impotent rage. Then the inevitable pivot. The panic shifted to pleading. Okay, look, Leo, I was wrong. I was an idiot. The investors, they were pushing me. It was a mistake. Come back. Name your price. We can say this was all a publicity stunt. We can make you a partner, a full partner. Your name on the door next to mine. Kent and Leonora. How does that sound? The offer was pathetic. The very thing I had once dreamed of was now being offered to me as a bribe, a desperate attempt to put the ghost back in the machine. A year ago, I might have wept with gratitude. Now it just sounded like the squeal of a pig in a slaughterhouse. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about clarity. I said, the Gilded Spoon is booked for the next 6 months, Jameson. I have to go. I have a kitchen to run. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. I just felt clear. The power hadn't just shifted. It had been reclaimed. It had come home. He had spent 5 years taking my name, and in a single night, Arthur Vance had given it back to me, polished and gleaming. Jameson thought he could counter my move. He was playing checkers. I had been setting up a chessboard for 5 years. This was checkmate. A week after the review dropped, I agreed to meet him, not because I owed him an explanation, but because I owed myself a final, clean closure. He wanted to meet at his restaurant, his territory, but I refused. I chose a neutral space, a sterile, anonymous coffee shop, halfway between his world and mine. It was a place with no history, no ghosts. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table in the corner. The man who walked into that coffee shop was not the same man who had fired me. The bespoke chef's whites were gone, replaced by a rumpled, expensive-looking sweater that couldn't hide the slump of his shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes puffy and bloodshot. The charismatic, camera-ready smile was gone, leaving behind the raw, insecure architecture of a man in free fall. He looked smaller, somehow, defeated. I sat down opposite him. I didn't order anything. I just waited. He started talking immediately, a torrent of excuses and justifications. He blamed the investors, the critics, the changing tastes of the public. He never once used the word I. It was a masterclass in deflection, but the performance was weak, the delivery unconvincing. He was a king without a kingdom, and he knew it. Then came the threats again, but this time they were laced with desperation. My lawyers are drafting the lawsuit, Leonora, for the recipes. They are the property of the restaurant. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. I let the silence hang in the air. Are they? I asked quietly. Are the Midnight Sun tomatoes also the property of the restaurant? Because I spoke to Alistair this morning. He seems to be under the impression that his produce is loyal to a person, not a business entity. His face went ashen. It was the one detail he could never have known, the secret handshake he was never privy to. It was the foundation of the entire enterprise, and it had just crumbled beneath his feet. He sagged in his chair, the fight draining out of him. Why are you doing this? He whispered. It was a genuine question. He truly could not comprehend my motivation. In his world, everything was transactional. He couldn't understand an action born of principle. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low and precise. You asked me that day, in the service alley, to think about the brand. You said it was all about the brand. I took your advice. I'm building my own. I paused, letting the words sink in. And you said you needed to cut costs. You saw my salary as an expense to be eliminated. You were right, in a way. You did cut a cost, but you failed to understand the value. This, I said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us, at the wreckage of his career. This is the cost. I stood up. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to say. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. It was the look of a man who was used to getting his way, who had just discovered that his currency, his charm, his name, his power, was worthless. Leo, please, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Don't do this. I looked down at him one last time. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. It was about restoring a natural balance that had been upset by his arrogance and my silence. I said, I already did. Then I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him alone with his empty cup and the ruins of his reputation. I didn't look back. 2 weeks later, the news broke in all the industry trades. Jameson Kent's flagship restaurant was closing for an indefinite period of rebranding. The Michelin star was officially rescinded. The investors had pulled out, forcing him to sell his majority stake. He was gone. It happened quietly, without a dramatic public firing. He just faded away. His noise was replaced by silence. It was the most fitting end I could imagine. Meanwhile, my world was filled with glorious, purposeful noise. The Gilded Spoon was no more. After a long conversation with Mrs. Gable, we decided to rename it. We called it Aura. It was a name that spoke to the invisible, the essential, the very thing Jameson had tried and failed to own. Mrs. Gable, no longer defeated, was my partner. She ran the front of house with a warmth and grace that charmed everyone. Marco was my official sous chef, my right hand, his talent finally given a stage where it could shine. Miguel and Sophia were my core team. We were small, but we were a family, bound by respect and a shared passion. I found myself in my new tiny office, a space that used to be a broom closet. On the wall I had framed Arthur Vance's review, not as a trophy of my victory over Jameson, but as a reminder that your work will always speak for itself, even if it has to learn to shout. I was sketching out ideas for a new menu, for the spring season. The food was evolving, changing, growing beyond what I had created at Kent's. It was mine, in a way it never had been before. I felt a sense of peace, of rightness. The vindication wasn't in his failure, it was in my success. It was in the simple, profound joy of creating something beautiful and calling it my own. This whole journey, it was never really about the food, not entirely. The food was just the language I used to tell the story, and for a long time someone else was speaking for me. They say that success is the best revenge. I don't think that's true. It's not about revenge, it's about reclamation. It's about taking back the narrative of your own life, about refusing to be a footnote in someone else's story. It's about understanding that your worth isn't determined by the person who signs your paycheck or the name on the door. Your worth is inherent. It's in your hands, in your mind, in your soul. For 5 years, I worked in the shadows, believing that my hard work would eventually be recognized. I waited for a seat at a table that was never meant for me. The biggest lesson I learned is that you cannot wait for someone to give you power. You cannot wait for them to see you. You have to build your own table. You have to be your own light. You have to be willing to walk away from the gilded cage, no matter how comfortable it seems, and step into the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of the unknown. My name is Leonora. I am a chef, and for the first time in a very long time, my story is my own. So I want to share this with you, not as a boast, but as a testament to the power of quiet competence, of integrity, of knowing your own value even when the world is trying to convince you that you have none. My story is my own, but I know, with absolute certainty, that I am not the only one who has ever had to fight to be seen, to be heard, to be credited for the work of their own hands. And sharing these stories, knowing we are not alone in the fight, that is how we begin to change the world. It's how we help each other find the strength to build our own tables, and knowing that makes all the difference.